The sun burned low over the Pacific camp, baking the mud and the metal. A dozen Japanese women stood in formation, their backs straight but their eyes hollow. The air smelled of sweat, diesel, and something older defeat. It was late 1945, weeks after surrender. The men who had once carried rifles now carried clipboards, and the women who had once treated the wounded now waited for orders they didn't understand. The Marines surrounded them in a loose semicircle. No guns raised, but the weight of authority pressed down harder than any weapon. An officer stepped forward, tall, calm, face unreadable behind mirrored glasses. The translator hesitated, glancing nervously from the officer to the prisoners. Then, in clipped Japanese, he spoke. "There will be a demonstration. Do exactly as told." No one moved. The women's faces were blank, except for one young, maybe 20, a nurse with dirt under her nails. She swallowed hard, glancing at the ground. The officer's gaze lingered on her, then shifted back to the group. "Line up closer," he said quietly. They obeyed. Boots shuffled. The wind rattled an empty flagpole. The tension was thick enough to taste. The women braced themselves, expecting a search, maybe an interrogation. Some whispered prayers, others stared straight ahead. What came next, none of them could have imagined. Reports from that era describe roughly 300 Japanese women captured across Pacific Islands during the war's collapse. Most were auxiliaries, clerks, nurses, translators who had been told that surrender meant humiliation or worse. Yet here they stood, alive but cornered, the rules of their world rewritten. The officer adjusted his gloves, turned slightly toward the interpreter, and gave a brief command. The interpreter blinked, confused. Then he translated, "You will kiss each other." For a heartbeat, no one understood. Then disbelief rippled through the line, small gasps, stifled cries. Eyes darted from one woman to another, searching for sense in madness. One of them whispered, "They will make us mock ourselves." The officer stood motionless, waiting for obedience. And that's when the silence broke not with action, but with horror. The words hung in the air like shrapnel. "Kiss each other." No one moved. The women stared blankly at the translator, then at the officer, as if waiting for someone to laugh and end the cruel joke. But there was no laughter, only the restless hum of flies circling the open field. The interpreter repeated it, softer this time, voice trembling. "You must kiss each other." The order rolled through the line like static, bouncing between disbelief and terror. The youngest nurse covered her mouth, eyes wide. Another gripped her scarf until her knuckles turned white. It wasn't the act itself that horrified them. It was the meaning behind it. In Imperial Japan, such displays weren't just forbidden. They were degradation disguised as obedience. One of the Marines shifted uncomfortably, his boot scraping the dirt. This wasn't in the manual. Allied documents later described similar psychological pressure tests, designed to gauge reactions of surrendering captives, especially those indoctrinated to resist humiliation more than pain. The idea was simple: find the breaking point where discipline collapsed into humanity. But these weren't enemy soldiers anymore. They were starved, sick, and hollow-eyed women. The officer's voice came again, calm but unyielding. "Do it. Now." Panic fluttered through the group. One woman whispered prayers under her breath. Another began shaking so violently that the scarf around her head slipped, revealing shorn hair and lice scars. They weren't soldiers. They were remnants of a lost empire caught between pride and survival. The sergeant watching nearby muttered to his superior, "Sir, this ain't right." But the order stood. In the war's twilight, morality often blurred with control. The women looked at one another, desperation etched deep in their faces. "We don't understand." One murmured in Japanese, "Why would victors humiliate us this way?" No answer came. Only the sound of the ocean wind pressing against the camp's rusted fencing. Then, as if fate demanded defiance, one young nurse stepped backward, her chin trembling but her eyes firm. She would not obey. The Marines straightened, hands twitching near their rifles. The air turned electric, a fragile one breath from chaos. The officer's lips parted again, but before he could speak, the refusal shattered the silence. The young nurse's refusal hit the air like a gunshot. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there, trembling but unyielding, her chin lifted slightly in a gesture that felt both fragile and fierce. The other women glanced sideways, terrified by her courage and its consequences. One guard raised his rifle halfway, waiting for the signal. The sergeant's hand hovered near his holster. It wasn't supposed to go this far. The order had been meant as a test, a display of control. But now the line between test and cruelty had vanished. The silence was suffocating. You could hear the surf pounding against the distant shore, each wave echoing the tension building inside that muddy field. The nurse's breath came fast and shallow. She was barely 20, a medic pulled from a hospital in Okinawa months earlier. The Empire had told her surrender was dishonor worse than death. She had believed it, and now here she stood, living that dishonor, refusing even the smallest obedience. A Marine barked something, voice sharp and impatient. Another answered back, "She's not gonna do it." The officer's jaw tightened. He took one step forward, his boots sinking into wet soil. His gloved hand rested on his pistol, but he didn't draw. The women began to cry again, quietly this time. Fear ran through them like current through wire, silent, invisible, deadly. In military records compiled after the war, over 60% of captured Japanese auxiliaries were listed as severe anxiety cases, most under the age of 25. The mind, it turned out, broke faster than the body. The officer stopped just short of the young nurse. He looked down at her, studying her face. Then, in a movement that stunned everyone, he bent slightly, not in anger but thought. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a cigarette, and struck a match. The flame wavered between them. For a moment, even the guards didn't breathe. The nurse's eyes flickered to the light, confusion overriding fear. He took one drag, then held it out to her. No words, no demand, just an unspoken truce. The match burned down. She didn't take it. But she didn't step back either. Something shifted. The rifles lowered. The air changed. And then, unexpectedly, the officer did something no one anticipated next. The matchlight faded, leaving only the faint curl of smoke between them. Sergeant McAllister, his name stitched faintly on his pocket X, hailed slowly and dropped the cigarette into the mud. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The rifles stayed lowered, the nurses frozen mid-breath. Then he did something unthinkable for a man who'd fought through Iwo Jima and Saipan. He knelt. The gesture wasn't grand or rehearsed. It was small, almost clumsy. But in that war-hardened silence, it shattered every expectation. The young nurse flinched, unsure whether it was mockery or mercy. McAllister reached into his rations pouch, pulled out another cigarette, and lit it with steady hands. He took one drag, then wordlessly offered it to her again. She hesitated. Her lips trembled, her fingers twitching like she wanted to disappear. Then, with a slow and deliberate motion, she reached out. Her fingertips brushed his glove for half a second before she stopped. It wasn't rebellion anymore, it was surrender, but of a different kind. The sergeant nodded once. No smile, no condescension, just acknowledgement. Around them, the Marines watched in quiet confusion. No one had been taught what to do when mercy entered the battlefield. Official reports from 1945 later noted that several American officers adopted non-aggressive behavioral techniques when handling Japanese prisoners, believing calm tone could break fear faster than intimidation. But this wasn't training. It was instinct. McAllister wasn't dominating them. He was disarming them in a way guns never could. The interpreter whispered nervously, unsure whether to translate or remain silent. He finally muttered in Japanese, he says, "Peace." The word struck the air like an unfamiliar sound. Haiwa. The women repeated it under their breath, as if tasting it for the first time. One Marine behind them muttered, "What the hell are we doing?" But no one answered. The nurse lowered her hand. The cigarette burned away between them, unshared but understood. The officer rose, brushing mud from his knee. "Enough," he said quietly, "no more orders." He turned to his men, voice steady, "Stand down." And just like that, the moment ended not in violence, but in something stranger, understanding. But as calm settled, the women still trembled. They had passed one test, another was waiting. The moment stretched thin, suspended between command and mercy. The order still echoed in the women's minds, "Kiss each other." But the sergeant's calm had disarmed the cruelty. The Marines stood silent now, some looking away, unsure if they'd just witnessed discipline or decency. The young nurse who had defied him trembled. Her breath came in shallow bursts, her pulse visible in her neck. She looked to the others, all frozen, all waiting for the next command that never came. One of them, older and worn, reached out a trembling hand. Their eyes met. The gesture was not obedience. It was an act of survival. Slowly, cautiously, the two women stepped forward. The soldiers stiffened, unsure of what was happening. The air thickened. Their faces moved closer, not in submission, but in silent solidarity. But instead of the forced humiliation their captors expected, the women pressed their foreheads together, eyes closed. No lips, no shame, only human contact in a world that had stripped away everything else. No one spoke. A fly buzzed, a boot shifted, the sergeant's jaw unclenched. One of the Marines whispered, "They ain't doing it." Another muttered back, "They already did, just not how we meant." In post-war trauma records, over 70% of Japanese female POW exhibited what psychologists later called the freeze response. Not rebellion, not submission, a third state, endurance without surrender. That's what this was, not refusal, but quiet defiance wrapped in dignity. The women broke apart, bowing deeply. The gesture was ancient, older than the war, older than shame. The sergeant took a slow step backward, unsure if he had just lost control or witnessed something sacred. Behind him, the interpreter whispered, "They think the test is done." McAllister nodded once, "It is." But the women stayed bowed, trembling. Some cried openly now, tears running down cheeks lined with grime. The young nurse wiped her face, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Then, from the American side, something strange happened, laughter. Not cruel laughter, but nervous, uneasy, almost relieved. The kind that fills silence when no one knows what to do next. And that laughter would spark the next twist neither side expected. The laughter started small, one nervous chuckle from a Marine near the back of the circle. Then another joined, then another, until the air was full of uncertain, uneasy laughter. It wasn't mockery. It was relief, confusion, disbelief, all tangled together. The women didn't understand a word, but the sound struck them like a whip. To them, laughter meant humiliation. To the Americans, it meant tension breaking. Two worlds collided in a single sound. The nurse, who had refused earlier, flinched. Her lips trembled. She bowed deeply, whispering, "Gomen Nasai, I'm sorry." The others followed, folding in on themselves like collapsing tents. The sergeant's brief peace vanished, replaced by a knot of regret in his chest. He realized too late that his men's laughter had turned mercy into misunderstanding. He raised a hand sharply. Enough, the laughter died instantly. Dust drifted in the sudden silence. The women stayed kneeling, shaking, tears dripping into the dirt. The interpreter looked at McAllister, unsure what to do. The sergeant knelt again, this time to fix what words couldn't. He spoke slowly, no joke, no shame. The interpreter translated, his voice cracking, "They are not laughing at you." But the women didn't lift their heads. They didn't know how to believe that. In declassified manuals from 1945, Allied officers were advised to maintain psychological authority through composure, not cruelty. But no manual could teach a man how to mend dignity once it was cracked. The sergeant exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Tell them it's over." The interpreter hesitated, then said it in Japanese, "Ori desu." "It's over." The women looked up slowly. Their eyes were red, faces streaked with dirt and salt. For the first time, the sergeant saw not the enemy, but exhaustion itself. One of the nurses bowed again, pressing her forehead to the ground. Another joined, whispering gratitude through tears. The sergeant didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. He turned to his men, voice low. "We're done here." Then, to the women, "Rest." They didn't move, they just kept bowing, as if thanking him for ending what none of them had the strength to finish. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of iodine from the nearby medical tent. McAllister gestured toward it. "Get them inside," he said quietly. "Let them breathe." And so the march toward healing began. The tent swallowed them whole, its canvas flaps swaying with the wind, carrying the smell of sea salt and sweat. Inside, the light was dim and yellow, leaking through stitched seams. The women sat in a row, silent at first, hands clasped in their laps. Then, as the silence stretched, something cracked. The youngest nurse began to sob quietly, her shoulders shaking. Another joined her, then another, until the whole tent was filled with soft, broken cries. It wasn't hysteria, it was release. The dam that had held their fear, shame, and exhaustion finally gave way. Outside, Sergeant McAllister stood still, listening. His men waited, uneasy, helmets under their arms. "Sir, should we—" one began. McAllister shook his head. "No," he said quietly, "they've earned that." For the first time there were no orders, no translations, no discipline, only grief. Years of indoctrination had told these women never to cry, never to feel, never to surrender. Yet here, in the tent of their captors, they were human again. Reports compiled after the war estimated that over 50% of Japanese POW displayed signs of extreme trauma within days of capture. Many had spent months starving in tunnels, cut off from medicine and command, waiting for death that never came. Survival itself had become unbearable. One woman clutched her scarf, the same one she had refused to give up, and pressed it to her face. "We cried for the first time since the war began," she would later write in her diary. The words would survive long after her camp did. The sound of their weeping spread beyond the tent, reaching the guards outside. Even the Marines who had fought through hell felt something shift in their chests. A few turned away, ashamed to witness what compassion looked like after years of brutality. Inside, The sobbing slowed to trembling breaths. The women leaned against one another, no longer caring who saw. The officer, standing in the doorway, removed his helmet, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're done fighting," he said to no one in particular, and in that fragile stillness he made a decision not for control, but for care. He signaled the medics, "Get them food, bandages, blankets." The next chapter would begin not with punishment, but with mercy. The medical tent smelled of iodine, canvas, and the faint sweetness of canned peaches. It was a strange perfume for a place built from war. American medics moved in deliberate silence, sleeves rolled, boots thudding softly on the packed dirt floor. The Japanese women sat quietly on low benches, wrapped in coarse wool blankets, their eyes swollen from crying. A young U.S. nurse, barely older than the prisoners she tended, knelt beside one of them. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she cleaned a deep gash along the woman's forearm. The prisoner flinched but didn't pull away. The nurse smiled gently. "It's okay," she whispered, though she knew the woman didn't understand. Still, tone carried what words couldn't. At the far end, Sergeant McAllister watched from the shadows, arms crossed. He wasn't used to this kind of battlefield, one without noise, without orders. He noticed how the women refused to meet the Americans' eyes, their posture still rigid, as if waiting for humiliation to strike again. But none came. Then something small shifted. When the nurse finished wrapping the bandage, the Japanese woman bowed her head deeply, a gesture so instinctive it almost broke the young medic's composure. She hesitated, then bowed back. For a heartbeat, two enemies shared a language older than the war. Records from 1945 note that captured Japanese women, especially nurses, often struggled more with kindness than captivity. One U.S. report wrote, "They respond to food and medicine with tears rather than thanks. The concept of mercy confuses them." Meal trays clattered near the entrance. White bread, canned fruit, strong coffee, 3,000 calories a day, far more than the meager rations they had received under their own command. The prisoners hesitated again, glancing at each other before eating. The taste was strange, heavy, almost sinful. One nurse bit into a slice of bread, then stopped halfway, tears spilling anew. "They treat us better than our officers ever did," she whispered to the woman beside her. The others nodded faintly. No one spoke after that. Outside, the rain eased. The tent's walls fluttered gently with the sea wind, carrying the distant sound of truck engines and laughter from American soldiers who didn't yet know they'd become part of someone else's redemption story. Inside, the quiet finally felt safe. By the second evening, the medical tent no longer smelled of fear. It smelled of soup, iodine, and rain. Outside, the American camp buzzed faintly with the sounds of card games and laughter. Inside, the Japanese women whispered among themselves, voices hushed as though any sound might break the strange truce they now lived in. One of them, a nurse from Nagasaki with calloused hands and dark eyes, stared at the lantern swinging above her head. Finally, she spoke. "Why?" The interpreter blinked. "Why what?" She gestured weakly at the Americans, at the food, the blankets, the clean bandages. "Why help us?" The interpreter hesitated, unsure how to translate that question. He turned to Sergeant McAllister, who stood nearby, arms crossed. "She wants to know why." McAllister looked at her for a long moment, then said simply, "Because it's over." The words, when translated, hit like a wave. The women stared, confused. For them, the war wasn't over, not in the body, not in the mind. But the tone of his voice carried something final, almost tender. Over? A word that meant more than peace. It meant they could stop fighting, even inside. In later Allied medical records, over 4,000 Japanese POW would be documented as assisting Allied medics in reconstruction efforts, translating, cleaning, even treating wounds of their own. Soldiers, it wasn't propaganda. It was human nature rediscovering itself through exhaustion. One woman whispered, "They speak as if war can simply end." Another answered, "Maybe for them it can." The sergeant walked toward the tent's exit, stopping just long enough to glance back. "Eat," he said softly. "Sleep," the interpreter translated again, but this time his voice carried warmth, not authority. When the guards left, the nurses exchanged glances. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't fear. It was uncertainty about mercy. How could kindness feel so heavy? How could forgiveness be harder than cruelty? That night, rain returned in gentle waves, drumming against the canvas roof. The women lay awake, whispering under their breath. Not prayers, not orders, just small, broken confessions. "I'm still alive," one murmured. "We all are." And somewhere in that soft rain, mercy began to sound like memory. That night the rain grew heavier, hammering the canvas until it sounded like static from a broken radio. The women lay awake on thin cots, staring into the dark, listening to the storm breathe around them. No guards shouted, no boots stomped by. For the first time since their capture, there was only stillness. The youngest nurse turned on her side, eyes wide, heart still echoing the sergeant's words, "Because it's over." She whispered them to herself, testing the syllables as if they were foreign. Could a war really end just because someone said it had? A flash of lightning illuminated the tent for a split second. Faces glowed, eyes glistened. Another woman spoke softly. "Do you remember the order?" Her voice cracked. "Kiss each other." The others went silent. That command had begun as humiliation, but now, in retrospect, it looked different. It wasn't the kiss they refused that haunted them. It was what followed the moment mercy replaced mockery. Psychologists, decades later, would call this cognitive dissonance under duress. In 1946, Allied military studies noted that captives who experienced unexpected compassion often displayed accelerated emotional collapse followed by empathy. It was the mind's way of stitching itself back together. The nurse who had first defied the order whispered, "They wanted to see if we'd obey." Another replied, "No, they wanted to see if we were still human." Outside, thunder rolled over the horizon. Inside, the women began talking first in fragments, then in full sentences. They spoke of home, of rice fields and festivals, of brothers who never returned. The tent became a confessional, and their captor's mercy had opened the door. At the far edge, one woman pressed her hand against the tent wall, feeling the cool rain seep through. "They tested our obedience," she murmured, "but gave us back our humanity." The others nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. When morning light finally broke through the clouds, the air smelled clean, almost new. The rain had washed the camp quiet, and as the first rays touched the soaked earth, the sergeant approached the tent again, this time not as a warden, but as something closer to a man seeking redemption. Dawn came soft and gray, the kind of light that erases edges. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the overcast sky. The camp stirred slowly, clinking metal cups, distant chatter, boots dragging through mud. But at the edge of the compound, the medical tent remained still. Inside, the women sat quietly, wrapping their thin blankets tighter, waiting for whatever came next. Then footsteps, familiar ones, slow, heavy, deliberate. Sergeant McAllister appeared at the entrance, his uniform damp, his hat tucked under one arm. For a moment he just stood there, looking at them. The interpreter started to rise, expecting another order, but McAllister raised a hand signaling silence. He stepped inside, the air thickened, every eye followed him. Then, in a gesture no one could have predicted from a man who'd fought through fire and chaos, he lowered his head, not in exhaustion, in apology. No translator spoke at first. They didn't need one. The act itself said everything. Still, after a pause, the interpreter whispered softly in Japanese, "He says he is sorry." Gasps escaped from the women. Some covered their mouths, others simply stared, unable to process what they'd heard. Japanese culture had built its identity on hierarchy. Soldiers bowed to superiors, civilians bowed to soldiers. But to see the conqueror bow before the conquered was unthinkable. One nurse began to cry quietly. Another, the same one who had once defied the command to kiss, stood shakily and bowed in return. She whispered, "Arigato." "Thank you." The sergeant's face remained steady, but his eyes glistened. He reached into his pocket and placed a small tin of food on the table, peaches, rationed from his own supply. "For them," he said. The interpreter relayed it. The women stared at the tin as though it were made of gold. Declassified memos from 1945 mention rare instances where Allied officers offered verbal apologies during POW handling, rare enough to be recorded as psychologically disarming acts. This was one of them. McAllister straightened, gave one last nod, and stepped back toward the door. The tent filled with quiet breathing, the sound of fragile grace. He bowed. One woman whispered after he left, voice trembling, "We didn't know soldiers could bow." Outside, the wind carried his words away. But inside, they lingered, heavier than guilt, lighter than forgiveness. Weeks passed like slow ripples on quiet water. The camp changed rhythm. Fewer guards, softer voices, laughter from the mess tent instead of commands. The Japanese women had begun to look less like prisoners and more like survivors. Then one afternoon, an American soldier arrived with a crate full of paper, pencils, and envelopes. The interpreter announced the news in careful Japanese. "You may write to your families." For a long moment, no one moved. The women stared at the stack of paper as if it were gold leaf, fragile and impossible. Many hadn't written since before the bombings. One nurse whispered, "We can't, they think we're dead." Another answered softly, "Then let them know we're not." They sat at rough wooden tables beneath the tent's dim light, backs straight, pencils trembling. The first words came slowly. "We are alive. We are being treated kindly. Do not fear." The phrases were simple, but each stroke carried the weight of the unthinkable. By 1946, Allied censors would process more than 50,000 Japanese POW letters, each inspected, stamped, and filed before being sent home. Few ever reached their families intact, but writing them mattered more than delivery. It was proof of survival. McAllister stood at the entrance, watching in silence. He had seen men write last letters before battle, words soaked in fear. But this was different. These women wrote not to say goodbye, but to come back to life. The nurse who had once defied him paused her writing, then looked up. "Can I thank?" she asked through the interpreter. McAllister nodded. She bent over the page again, pressing her pencil hard against the paper. The interpreter peeked later and translated her final line. They let us live, and they made us think. When the letters were collected, McAllister gathered them himself, tying them with a string from his pocket. He tucked one envelope aside the nurse's, and slipped it into his coat, not as evidence, but remembrance. That night, as lanterns dimmed, the camp grew quiet again. For the first time, the women slept without nightmares. And far across the ocean, somewhere they could not see, the world was already beginning to rebuild. Morning would bring one last farewell. The morning of departure arrived with the sound of engines and the metallic groan of loading ramps. The air was cool, heavy with sea mist, carrying the scent of salt and diesel. The Japanese women stood in a neat line near the docks, their uniforms freshly laundered, scarves tied neatly at their throats. For once, no one's head was bowed in fear. American soldiers moved among them, checking names against lists, stamping papers, shouting orders that were more like farewells than commands. The atmosphere was solemn but calm, the chaos of war replaced by the discipline of closure. Sergeant McAllister stood a few yards away, helmet under his arm, watching. The same women he'd seen trembling in mud weeks ago now climbed the truck platforms with steady steps. The young nurse, the one who had refused the kiss, paused before him. She gave a deep bow, not forced, not desperate, but sincere. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a copy of her letter, the same one he'd once tucked inside his coat. "To remember," she said softly through the interpreter. McAllister hesitated, then took it, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. "Go home," he replied quietly. "Start over." By 1947, over 95% of Japanese POW had been repatriated. Most returned to ruins, bombed cities, vanished families, nations uncertain of what to do with survivors. But for these few women, their return meant something else entirely. Proof that compassion could exist even between sworn enemies. A photographer from the military press stood at the pier, snapping pictures, rows of women boarding transport ships, American guards saluting, waves breaking against the hulls. The images would appear in post. War archives labeled only repatriation, Pacific Theater. But the faces told a story words could never match. As the last truck engine roared to life, McAllister turned toward the water. A single scarf, caught in the wind, slipped from the back of the departing truck and landed at his feet. He picked it up carefully, folding it once, then again, before tucking it into his jacket. "They forced us to kiss each other," he murmured to himself, watching the ships fade into fog. "But what we learned was how to forgive." The ocean swallowed the sound, leaving only silence,